Hello, and welcome back to the Let's Talk Universal podcast. Today, I am joined by Cheryl Hurst, behavioural scientist and diversity, equity, inclusion expert. Hello, Cheryl, how are you?
Hi, I'm well, thank you.
Good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Um, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to start with learning a little bit about you and what your background is.
Yeah, absolutely. I am a behavioral scientist. I finished my PhD right at the end of the pandemic, actually, in organizational behavior. And then I jumped right into a postdoc and I had a lectureship. And throughout that time, I was working as a consultant essentially for various different aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So things like talking about inclusive cultures, about how we can use organizational behavior to improve our decision-making processes. And then I realized that actually the academic route wasn't for me, and I went into a corporate role in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And before my PhD, I did a master's in organizational psychology. And before that, did my undergrad in neuroscience and brain and cognition. So always a bit of psychology. Didn't really expect to be in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but all of my work has kind of focused on that throughout my life. So it makes logical sense that I'm here now.
And what is it that interests you most about how the behavioral scientist stuff kind of works with the DE&I stuff?
I think my favorite aspect of, I guess, human behavior in general is how little we actually understand what drives our behavior and how our brains do things. And I don't mean how little we understand as a research community, but as human beings, when we think we're making certain choices because of certain things. And then when you actually take a look at the science, and I say science, psychology, anthropology, brain and cognition, so many different elements, the reasons we do the things we do isn't actually as clear as we think it is. And that really relates to diversity and inclusion, and particularly the inclusion aspect, and particularly how we make choices. So that behavioral science part and how it works at organizations has always been really interesting to me.
Mm. And so let's just talk about the D&I industry in a more general sense, or DIB or idea, however you want to phrase it. How would you characterize the landscape right now compared to how it was a couple of years ago around sort of the pandemic era?
If I were to characterize it, I mean, I think if I were to think of one word, the word would probably be wonky. I can't think of a better word than that. I think there's two elements at play when it comes to the landscape, and there's one where it's getting harder and there's more burnout. So I'm not sure on the exact stats of this, but I remember reading that something like 60% of diversity officers of the S&P 500 companies left between 2018 and 2020. And I'm sure it's changed since then. So there's that aspect, the one avenue of the burnout. It's getting harder because they're under-resourced. They're essentially trying to solve world problems with very little resource. And then there's the other aspect that is more optimistic that I'm seeing, where there seems to be more science involved. And not that there wasn't necessarily science before, but I think it wasn't as collaborative and it wasn't as multidisciplinary. So HR was a very kind of one-track route, and DE&I tended to fall into HR. Whereas now I'm starting to see more people and more companies kind of embrace psychology, embrace what we know about anthropology, even, behavioral economics, things that impact us as we go out through our lives. That's so much more than women are treated this way, or, people with disabilities are treated that way. So I think there's the reason I say wonky is because I think some companies are going kind of in the right direction and it's going well, and then some companies seem to be going backwards. So it's a very kind of diverted area to work in right now.
And why do you think that some of those organizations are kind of falling back and those priorities for DE&I are kind of falling down the ladder within organizations?
So I think a big part of it is because diversity officers, diversity, equity, inclusion leaders, however you, as you pointed out, however you want to title them, have been set up to fail. So similar to a concept called the glass cliff, where we see women are more likely to be given leadership roles when the company's not doing that well. So it is, a glass cliff, and that they're kind of set up to fail. I think we're seeing that in that companies are implementing these leaders of diversity, equity, inclusion, not giving them resources, not allowing them to be part of the conversation when it comes to things like, HR and, finances and all the things that actually matter. So they're siloed into their kind of sphere of power, what they can change. And then people are surprised that they haven't changed anything. So it's like they're set up to failure and then they're not doing well. And it's very obvious from the outside why they're not succeeding. And then companies are thinking, well, we tried it. We hired a diversity officer and it did nothing. So obviously this thing isn't that important, because if it really mattered, we'd see success. And that's kind of what happened when we look at when things started to talk a bit more about inclusion. It was because, oh, well, we have diversity. We've had, let's say we went from 10% women in senior roles to 50% and nothing's changed. And it's like, yes, but the women that you appointed are still reporting that they aren't allowed to talk, that they're, being asked to take notes in meetings. So you aren't going to see the benefits of diversity without inclusion. In the same way, you're not going to see the benefits of diversity and inclusion officers if you don't actually give them a seat at the table. So I think that's the main reason that things aren't looking so good right now.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and I just want to go back to the science piece as well. Is I guess why do you think that people are now looking to kind of science and psychology and all of these other disciplines to solve their D&I problems?
So some people might not like this answer, but I do think that a lot of American academics are starting to go more into writing best-selling books about their research and like pop psychology. And it's starting to be transatlantic, and we're seeing more and more of it. I think we're seeing the same in the UK. You wouldn't have had Brian Cox, a physicist, doing world sellout tickets 10 years ago, really. Like, it's becoming more popular to talk about science and see how science relates to the real world. And some of my favorite authors are ex-academics or current academics. I think Adam Grant is a great example. Richard Thaler as well. And we have so many others that are making things more accessible. And I think it's becoming cool to know about outliers and various elements of psychology and behavioral economics. And because of that, companies are trying to establish ways to incorporate it a little bit. So I don't want to say that academics are suddenly cool again, but I do think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, and that's interesting because it's almost, by the sounds of it, fashionable, as is this topic of neurodiversity, which kind of, I suppose, relates in some way. But neurodiversity has become this new buzzword, this new fashion trend in DE&I. But when it comes to organizations and prioritizing D&I or people and culture, why do you think that they should kind of still be putting an emphasis on that?
I mean, there's so many of like the basic reasons, right? So the really obvious ones, like making the complete use of the available workforce. I don't understand how we can think that we're hiring the best people when we're only hiring from a talent pool of, X number of people. Like, it just, that is illogical to me. There's enough research now. So a lot of the research that I look at for DE&I, and there's a lot of research that isn't good, but a lot of good research looks at team dynamics. And we actually know that people have even more constructive conflict when they're in teams of people who aren't like them. And that from that constructive conflict comes innovation. I don't believe that the best and most innovative companies in the world are surrounding themselves with, yes people. I don't think that's happening. We're seeing this conflict, and the only way to have that conflict is to have people from different experiences. And that to me is a big selling point. And I don't understand why a company wouldn't prioritize that, except that I see why they don't prioritize that. And I do think a big challenge is it's really hard to change, and people don't like changing when it's been fine for them thus far. So.
And just kind of reflecting on your work as a consultant, now you've been consulting in this space for several years. From that experience, are there any common issues that you find organizations struggle with the most, or does it really depend on their size, their industry, as to what challenges they have?
It definitely depends on the industry and the size, for sure. I think some companies misinterpret what their actual problem is. Actually, not most companies that I see misinterpret what the problem is, but I see a lot of the things that I tend to do, kind of the interventions, is more just connecting problems with solutions. And that sounds so simple, and there's probably people that are going to be like, wow, people pay her to do that. But things like, they'll have a problem where people will be leaving the organization. So they'll see, women join our company and then they leave much faster and more often than men do. And their solution to that will be things like, a women's network. And I think that can be really helpful. But when you speak to the women about why they're leaving, it's because they're not being given career opportunities. And so a women's network isn't going to give women those career opportunities, right? You have to have more tangible links to the solutions. Another example is, when I see, we don't have, and I'll use the gender example again, because I think it's one of the easiest, but, women we don't have enough women in our company. And again, the solution is, okay, well, let's focus on culture, and they'll run like a cultural day. So how does that increase the number of women who are going to join your company? It's really understanding that connection between the problem and solutions that I see a lot happening, and that I really try to help companies kind of connect with that. But also, and sorry, this might be a bit of a tangent, but I also see companies going really hard on themselves for certain things. So for example, there's a company that I did some consultancy work with, and they were relatively homogenous in that they did hire quite often. They had mostly men in their organization. But when I looked at kind of the data that they provided, the majority of the men that they hired came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, men who had been previously released from jail or prison, or men who had previously been incarcerated. I'm actually not sure what the appropriate term is for that. And I was saying to them, you're providing an opportunity for people that wouldn't necessarily have an opportunity before. So you don't have to go so hard on yourself for other aspects just because you see this really big in the media. You're doing something that is important and tangible. And I think you've actually got quite an incredibly good organizational culture here. So I also do that a bit in helping companies focus on the positives instead of only focusing on the things that they're not doing right because the media says they're not doing it right.
And what kind of interventions do you use to help solve those problems for those companies?
So my big focus is on the employee experience from entry to exit. So that's generally what I kind of niche down to be about. And I try to identify that problem from entry to exit. And I try to say, okay, these are the things that you want to change. So recruitment process, selection, when people leave the company. And then I'll typically kind of I'll typically go into a very specific aspect of that. And an intervention might be as simple as having leaver interviews, asking people why they're leaving, and then we'll develop a further solution from there. An interview protocol is a big one that I've implemented quite a lot. So companies that say, oh, well, I don't like using the HR questions that I'm given because they're too prescriptive and they don't help me. But really explaining and helping people understand that the reason you have an interview protocol is so that you know that candidates are being treated equitably, and because it helps you identify appropriate candidates. So it really does depend on the company, kind of what the specific intervention is. But often for me, I find that it is around the recruitment process, and that's where people kind of struggle the most.
And we've previously mentioned, prior to this podcast, about how organizations tend to look for ways to measure their culture. And so from your experience, did you have any thoughts on how they might measure their culture?
Measuring culture is a long-standing challenge. I mean, some of Sheen's work from early 1900s, I think, looked at measuring culture. We have Hofstede's cultural dimensions, which have long been, not as necessarily something that organizational psychologists like. But measuring culture is really about having defined values that guide behaviors and actions. And the companies that I find when they say, oh, we really want to measure our culture, I say, well, what are your values? It's like, oh, well, we want to make a lot of money. It's like, well, that's not a value, is it? Or, they'll say, oh, well, we help people and we really love our employees and treat them like family. Again, not a value. So having those really specific values that guide behaviors and actions then helps companies understand what their culture is, because they can look at those behaviors and actions. Are people doing them? Is it happening? And that's a good way to measure culture. I mean, in terms of the actual I guess, instruments. We see surveys, we see questionnaires. I think companies rely too heavily on quantitative elements as opposed to how does it feel to work here? I mean, I think it's a bit silly that people think you can't feel a company culture. You can get someone external and you walk into a building and you can feel what it's like to work there, right? If people seem happy, if people seem unhappy. And I think we don't necessarily think about that enough. How people feel when they finish at the end of the day. That to me is a good measure of company culture. And it's very unique, and that doesn't help with really large organizations. But when you focus on those values and those behaviors, it gets us closer to an actual definition of what the company culture is.
No, I find that really interesting is actually understanding from an employee level how they feel about a culture. And I think a lot of organizations are still oh, our culture is this is what we as the middle management or as the organizational leaders think our culture is. And actually when you talk to people who are in the business and the employees of a business, they have a different perspective often of what the culture is.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like the idea of a thought leader. Someone else has to call you a thought leader. I don't think you get to say that you're a thought leader in the same way that I don't think companies get to define what their culture is. I think they can define their values and what they deem to be acceptable and unacceptable behavior, and then everyone else decides what their culture is. I don't think it's something that companies can actually decide for themselves.
And so I think we should probably talk about PeopleGaps, which of course you are a founder of. And that is helping to remove barriers to equity, diversity, and inclusion knowledge. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is, what services it offers, and to who?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really exciting for me. This is my company. Um, Essentially, when I finished my doctorate and I was doing a lot of work with companies on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I was geared towards, EDI task forces, EDI committees, EDI forums, whether that was very senior leaders who are often, the sponsor, whether it's a gender sponsor or LGBTQ plus sponsor or, neurodiversity sponsors, and then also kind of the people on the ground doing a lot of the work. I found that they don't have the access to the knowledge that I have as somebody who did a PhD that looked at, systemic barriers to career choices, essentially. And I was trying to find out why people weren't reading all of this information. And then, you go onto academic websites and you realize it's because they can't. It's behind paywalls, and it's incredibly difficult to understand. And, I spent 8 years at university reading all of this stuff. So to expect everybody to have 8 years of knowledge is impossible. And then as I was looking at various different types of companies that provide this type of training, I realized that actually they don't have the information either. So I think a good example is the only people that believe unconscious bias training works are people who are selling you unconscious bias training, right? It's very clear that there's money there. And I see it a lot, right? The only people I see defend unconscious bias training are people that sell it. And the reason for that is because we have no evidence that it works. And we've never had evidence that it works. And actually, the greatest body of literature on it shows that it actually has negative connotations to it in terms of when people do unconscious bias training. They think they've achieved this idea of moral credentials. So then they don't do the mental work necessary to actually overcome their biases. So it can actually have a backlash effect when we do this type of training. So as I was going to these organizations and I was meeting these people who were typically, in my experience, were typically women who were very passionate about making their organizations a better place. And they weren't being treated with respect because they didn't have the knowledge and information. So what PeopleGaps is designed to do is essentially give people this type of training on everything we know about what works. So what works when it comes to equality, what works when it comes to diversity and inclusion, what the research says about various situations and scenarios, how to react to different scenarios, how to talk to leadership about it in a way that they'll care, where to get more information. And it's essentially this kind of massive resource for people to be better at their jobs, and for a lot of people also side of desk. So essentially just to better understand diversity, equity, and inclusion knowledge based on my 8 years and my thesis.
And then from there, what kind of outcomes can they expect to get from that? What can they look forward to taking away from those courses? And are there any kind of I guess, benefits?
Yeah, of course. So there's various different things that PeopleGaps does. And I mean, I should say that right now, I was so overloaded with people that wanted to take the course that it's been full for a little while now. And I'm like struggling to keep up with demand almost. But one of the things that I've provided with it are things like, so, very simple things like talking points, things like what we know about what works. So 3 tangible things that you can do in your organization in the next 3 months to help improve something like your representation and targets, something to improve recruitment and selection, something to improve culture. So 3 tangible things you can do right now. I also break down things like, if you want to do this, let's say change recruitment, here are the types of people that you're going to need to have involved. So, HR, your recruitment team, your senior leadership team. So it kind of breaks down all of these ideas of it's just one person doing all the work. And actually, you can just pick 2 or 3 of these things and make a big difference. You don't need to do everything all the time. And then it also provides people with the tools to have these conversations. So this was the most important thing that I noticed, was that I was doing a lot of keynote speaking, a lot of talks, and I would have people approach me later and say, oh, I wish I had the confidence to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion like you do. And I only have that confidence because I've read a lot, and I'm very fine with being wrong. And I wish more people were just comfortable with being wrong. And so part of PeopleGaps is providing just people with that confidence to approach diversity, equity, inclusion conversations, prepare to be wrong, but also feel confident that they're right and where that information comes from. So those are the kind of tangible things. It also includes things like, worksheets, quizzes. I do one-on-one consultations with people that are part of the program. So I'm with you kind of every step of the way as you're trying to develop this change program within your organization.
I find all of that really fascinating, and I suppose it resonates as well with the things we're trying to do at the UWI, which is help to make all of these very big, scary topics within DE&I a lot more consumable, digestible, and actionable. Because I think the challenge is that these topics are huge. Even if you just pick neurodiversity as a focus, or another area, they're big, juicy topics. And so to completely comprehend and digest, and then what do I do now? it's quite laborious and emotionally draining, I suppose, for one person or a few people within an organization to actually do something about it.
Exactly. And especially when I find people are coming from a place of passion and lived experience. So often people who are part of kind of diversity, equity, inclusion reps or whatever it is, they have some kind of lived experience where they've been treated wrongly, or they've been discriminated against, or they've witnessed it, or a loved one has. And so they're coming at it very emotionally. And it can sometimes be difficult to say, hey, listen, you're not going to solve inequality right now, but you can make this place better for the people that work here. And kind of not lowering expectations, but making it more realistic within kind of our sphere of power, and letting people know that it's okay that inequality is going to continue to exist, but we can actually make a difference now. And that's a big part of the work that I try to do as well, is just to make people feel more comfortable with what they can achieve.
I really like that. And I just want to pick up on what you were saying about being a speaker and doing keynotes and doing speeches around this topic. Now, there's quite a range of topics that you speak about, but is there a topic in particular that you find people are interested most in hearing from you?
Yes, I get a lot of requests. So I really like focusing on how our brains play tricks on us. I really like the idea that our brains are just so complicated, and there's so little that we actually know about the brain and how it makes decisions. I mean, particularly when it comes to people who are neurodivergent, we don't necessarily understand how autism affects oxytocin and dopamine and all of these, like the feel-good hormones. We don't have a solid understanding of that. So that kind of thing I find really interesting. But the talk that I like to focus on is one where I just present optical illusions. And I tell people, here's what you're seeing, but here's what it actually is. You understand how an optical illusion works. And I like to use that as an example for things like when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Just because you know that the unconscious bias is there doesn't mean you're solving it. In the same way of just because you know an optical illusion, you're supposed to see one thing, doesn't mean that you're seeing it properly. Like, your brain plays tricks on you, and there's certain elements that we can solve But there's certain things that are biological, that are environmental, that we can't fix away. And that kind of optical illusion brain thing, I think, really gets people to understand why we need to have systemic change and why we can't just say, hey, why can't we all just be lovely, happy people who enjoy the world? It's because our brains are programmed certain ways, and we're not necessarily going to fix that with a 1-hour training course.
Of course. And one of the other things that you speak about is inclusive design. And I wondered if you might, just for those who perhaps aren't familiar with that, just explain what it is and why it's important for people to consider.
Yeah, so inclusive design is an approach to creating products, environments, and experiences that are accessible and usable to the widest range of people possible, kind of regardless of, age, ability, characteristic. And it's essentially about ensuring that everyone can participate, whether it's using an object or an environment. And inclusive design, when I use it, when I talk about it, it's about starting from the actual process. So instead of, and this happens quite a lot, we'll see, where someone will have a senior role and let's say they get, 2 applicants and they're both white men. And then they'll come and say, oh, hey, we need to get more people to apply. But in reality, if we looked at the inclusive design of the entire recruitment and selection process from the very beginning, we can solve that at the root and ensure that we're getting, and again, not just ensuring that we're getting, women or people from minority ethnic backgrounds to apply, but that we're getting the best quality white men as well. Like making from the very beginning, we can have a more inclusively designed recruitment process that ensures we're tapping into all of these important talent pools. So it's about kind of that entire system being designed in a way that is inclusive to everyone instead of waiting for the reactive response to whatever's going on.
And in a D&I context, I suppose it's about focusing on what the real problem is, as you've said previously, and then understanding that problem and why you have that problem, to then look at how you then make that process or that system more inclusive for people. I just wanted to ask, for those who are looking to be more inclusive in their workplace and perhaps to create momentum behind their D&I initiative, because I think there's that oh, we want to be inclusive and we're not right now, and how do we get from there to here to there? What would your kind of recommendation be for their first steps? Where should they look to first?
Is it part of their role, or are they just doing this because they want to, if that makes sense?
Well, I suppose if we took the specific role of a D&I leader within an organization, if we just looked at them, what might you recommend to them if they're rejoining perhaps joining a company, and they're starting, from scratch? Where might you recommend they start?
So I would absolutely recommend you have conversations with the most senior people in your organization to understand those values, behaviors, culture, and actions. And I did that, when I started the job that I'm in now. I emailed and said, hi, can I get 15 minutes with you, with the most senior person that I worked with, because I wanted to understand their approach and understand what I was up against. Fortunately for me, I wasn't up against anything. There was a lot of space and resources for me, but a lot of people are going to be up against somebody who says, hey, listen, we just need quick fixes, and that is something that you need to then approach and consider. All right, where are my quick fixes? And then understanding as well what kind of the deeper problems are. And that takes a lot of observing. It takes a lot of conversations, a lot of talking to people. I think that's really important. The DE&I lead, I think, should be the most visible person in a company wherever possible, really knowing what's happening versus what people are saying is happening and understanding all of those different elements. I think for the future of DE&I, a lot of that's going to be in data and understanding big data and understanding tech. So the first thing that I would also try to do is understand what data you have available to you. So if you can see what your representation numbers are, and not just because of a tick box, we want to have X number of women, but to see who's leaving, who's getting promoted, who are the new starters, who's hired, who's being hired from different places. All of that data, when you have that, you can build a really clear picture of your company values. If 10% of promotions last year went to a certain group, you know that there might be a bit of an issue. So that, I think, is the number one place to start the conversations, and then the data and what data is available to you. And if you don't have that data available, try to develop a system that says, hey, can we get this data? Can this data become available? Because it'd be really helpful to know.
And I think we've certainly seen a trend in sort of interest at industry events that organizations are looking more towards data and insights and technology for their to help solve their problems, whatever those problems may be. But I think that's also meant that D&I has dipped in sort of priorities, as we've mentioned, for organizations. And I'm hoping that in the future I get to explore this, further with you in what does D&I look like beyond, because I think at the moment what we're seeing is that D&I is seen as this do-gooder role, this almost this halo role of, yes, we have a D&I leader, and but how do they kind of move out of that role and be seen as a more strategic position, I guess?
Yeah, again, and this is where I can be a bit controversial, and I think there are some D&I leads that won't agree with me. I don't ever really describe myself as passionate. I'm not passionate about what I do any more than, perhaps someone who is an accountant is passionate about what they do. I'm educated, informed, and well qualified, right? People only ever describe like HR and DE&I leads as like passionate. I'm really well qualified to do what I do, as I think, that's what PeopleGaps was designed for, is to make people qualified at what they do. And I'm not saying that you have to have a PhD. That's not at all what I'm saying. But most DE&I leads that I meet know their stuff. So I think one of the ways to step away from that do-gooder role is to not focus too much on the smaller behavior aspects that we can't change, and on that kind of feel-good initiatives, but moving towards the bigger conversations that are harder to have and they're uncomfortable. And we can put our energy into saying, okay, there is actually a systemic problem here. We're seeing differences in promotion, or, we've hired X number of people from an underrepresented group, but it's not enough for us to represent the communities we serve. Or, small things that I think can make a difference. For example, I refuse to sit on all white panels. It's 2023. There are so many people who have various things that they should say, that they have, it's important that they have a voice. Things like that. I think it's 2023 now. We should be away from that anyway. But I think that is where I would focus my energy, on the bigger systemic changes, and to be able to have that language to talk about those systemic changes, understand the research, the data, the history, and move away from the feel-good, I'm passionate about what I do conversation. And people don't like that, because people are passionate, and I know that they're passionate and they want to talk about their passion. I think that's important, but if we want to kind of play that corporate game a little bit, we have to also show that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a fundamental business asset, and not just a feel-good thing when we have enough money and when the timing's right.
And as you said earlier, not just an HR role as well. It's much more than just HR. And I think part of the struggle of D&I is that there is some tension there with HR in saying, that we haven't hit these targets, or we're not doing this right, and HR feel that they're imposing on their role and responsibilities. So there is that dynamic as well to consider.
Definitely. And I used to feel really passionately that diversity, equity, and inclusion in HR should be separate, because diversity, equity, and inclusion works for the people and HR works for the company. And I've always believed that, right? When it comes down to it, HR is going to do whatever they can to protect that company. When DE&I will do whatever I can to protect that person. And those are very different approaches. I do think with kind of workplace regulation laws in the UK and the protection laws that we have, I actually think that HR and ED&I have more things in common than they used to. And we can kind of start to approach that with a bit of an approach on synergy, and that I think it's fundamental that HR representatives have an understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that DE&I should have an understanding of workplace discrimination law, the Equality Act, all of that kind of stuff, that I think those aren't always tied together that well.
And finally, I'd just like to ask if there's something that perhaps we haven't touched on that you want to add, or if there's something that we've briefly mentioned but you'd like to expand on.
Ooh. I mean, my biggest pet peeve, I always like to plug, diversity is a group level concept. You do not have diverse people. When we say that, we're assuming that there is one person who is the standard norm and then everyone else is a standard deviation away from that. And I absolutely can't stand that. So diversity is a group level concept. I might get that like tattooed on myself somewhere. I think also, and this is actually something that is relevant for a conversation I was having with a colleague today, that so many things are really individual and bespoke to certain people that we can't have blanket solutions for anything. I don't like when diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations turn towards treating people like they're victims of their situation, or assuming that everybody has the same viewpoint or even the same sense of humor. You know, one thing that insults another person might not insult another. And it just is about learning to adapt and be agile and flexible with how we understand situations and understand people, instead of trying to have this one size fits all solution, because we don't have a one size fits all solution for really anything in the corporate world or in our real lives. So I don't know why we would expect to have it for this. So I think it's about just maintaining a constant willingness to learn, a constant growth mindset where we understand we might be wrong, but we're leaning into that a little bit and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And it's been great to have you on the podcast today and to hear your perspectives on D&I and, you know, all of these topics that we've covered. I feel that we've covered quite a lot. And I'm also pleased to say that this won't be the last that we'll be hearing from you either. So you are already going to have committed or will be participating in our webinars and upcoming summit event. But once again, I just really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise and your insights with me and our audience today.
Thanks for having me. I had fun.